Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Angela Cox. Good morning to you, Angela.
Hello there, how are you?
I'm very well. We're spending a lot of time together at the moment,
Oh,
which is great. It's good to spend time with you because I know we're in the middle of creating a team coaching course within your organisation, which I'll just explain to people who you are. So you are a founder of Procedure 360, which is a coach training academy. But you're also a multi-award-winning executive coach and therapist, two-time best-selling author, and a podcast host as well. And you've helped thousands of people create transformational change in their lives and careers. And you're doing that now with helping people become coaches, and obviously the knock-on effect of that. And you've got a massive mission and a real passion about that. So before we get into a conversation, which is all about how people pretend in our leadership and wear masks and find that can be quite energy draining, and how that can really impact our true leadership, really, of who we are. I want to ask you, what do you love about what you do?
oh wow. Well, first of all, that intro you've just given me, I don't know where you've got that from, but it makes me sound really good. So thank you for that, Julian. Um, I guess it's a big question, that, because there are so many aspects to what I do that I love. But I think the first bit, I'm going to give three answers. The first bit would be the fact that I can now be myself doing what I do. And after a long career in corporate where I was pretending, and the impact of that was enormous, being able now to just show up as I am and give my views and help people the way I want to help them, that's like a breath of fresh air, to be able to do that every day. So I think that's the first one, which is quite introspective. The second one then is about really being able to help others take the mask off and being that mirror that helps them to see that it's there in the first place, and then guide them through the process of slowly uncovering who they are underneath the mask. And what's beautiful for me is when I look out and see a client maybe 18 months into that journey, so they might not even be working with me at that stage, but seeing the differences in them, in their lives, in their relationships with other people. That's just magic. And then the third bit is the impact now that I'm able to have in terms of sharing the model that I've created and seeing other coaches learn that model and go and work with their clients and get the same outcome. And what's beautiful about that for me is that shows that it's not Angela Cox, it's not an effect that only Angela can bring. It's an effect that when you apply a model in a certain way, other people can get that outcome too. And I think from a mission you talked about a minute ago, that for me it's got arms and legs, hasn't it? It's got the ability to really change lives, and that feels huge.
Wow. And it must be incredibly sort of fulfilling what you're doing right now.
I think that's a really good word, because as I said, I spent a career in corporate and did everything that you should do, on a piece of paper. I got to the top of the organizations. I got that amazing director title that I think my dad always wanted me to have. I got the money, I got the room with all the shoes in it. I had the car that I was supposed to drive, even though I hated it. So I had all of those things, but didn't actually have satisfaction. And I think on reflection, now that I know myself better, the satisfaction wasn't coming because I wasn't being myself. I had this perfectionist mask on and a people pleaser mask on, and it was exhausting. And now that I've taken that off, the fulfillment, beautiful word, is there. I can feel that, not every day, but most days, in the things that I do, and being able to recognize a job well done in a way that before I never could. And it was always just, tick, I've done that, on to the next thing, on to the next thing, on to the next thing, and never really feeling that sense of fulfillment.
And when you look back on your career, because you talked a lot about your previous career, and was there a moment or an experience that made you, I suppose, realize that you were wearing all these masks
Mm.
and the energy it was taking and how it was probably impacting you? There was a number of questions there. Almost, when was the moment and what happened? And how did you navigate that? And what was the difference and the shift that happened with you?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it was almost like a slow burn that I didn't notice until it was too late. And so what I was doing when I look back now is moving from organization to organization in quite quick succession. So, maybe 2 or 3 years within an organization, and then realizing that I didn't fit, or certainly the mass version of me was too exhausted to keep fitting. And so I would flit to something else. And I ended up flitting into consulting as my final sort of corporate role. And in consulting, it was great because I could flip from client to client quite quickly. So, I could almost like reinvent myself each time to be who they wanted me to be. And during that time, I went on a bit of a personal transformation journey. So I used to be very obese, and I was like that for a long time. And in 2016, I decided to go on this sort of wellness mission and started to eat properly and exercise, and lost 8 stones in the process of doing that.
Wow.
And it was a wow, because do you know what, Gillian? I always had that feeling that I'll be happy and I'll be perfect and I'll be fulfilled when I'm thin. That was sort of, as someone who'd been very overweight since childhood and all through my adult life, that was a little mantra that I used to play to myself. And it was part of my not good enough program because, people don't think you're any good because you're bigger or whatever. All the stories I used to tell myself. And I remember getting down to the elusive size 10 and standing in front of the mirror and just going, well, you're not happy and you're not fulfilled and you've got to where you wanted to get to. And that was the start of the turning point, which was, well, hang on. If I've got this ticked very good now, why don't I feel tick very good? Why don't I feel brilliant?
Mm-hmm.
And it was sort of that started to play on my mind. And then I just remember walking into work one day and being told about this new project they wanted me to lead on. I said, you know what, I can't do this anymore. And I was such a lot of money. It was ridiculous. And do it. And I walked away from it. And I remember ringing my husband on the way home, sitting in this Audi TT, which was a car I absolutely hated because it was so claustrophobic inside. And just saying to him, I've resigned today. And he went, what? And I went, yeah, I've resigned. I can't do it anymore. Really different. I said, I don't know what it is yet, but I know, and I've made a promise to him. I said, whatever it is, it's not going to change our lifestyle in a detrimental way. So I said, I'll earn the same amount of money or more. That's my mission, but I need to do something that I'm going to love myself as part of. And that was that kind of moment where, you hit the wall and you decide you're going to do something differently. And I wouldn't recommend that to people because it's a massively crazy step at one level, just walking away from that career. But for me, it had to be done.
That's interesting, and it almost became a point where you almost sounds like you jumped off really, and got jumped off the bandwagon of wearing masks, the bandwagon of doing stuff that you don't really feel very fulfilled with.
Yeah.
That takes a lot of, well, you could say courage, you could say stupidity in terms of the reality of that at the time. Not I'm judging it in that sense, but it sounds quite brave. What was going through your mind when you made that decision? Because it'd be interesting, just because that's quite a big thing to do, to make a step. And I know when I stepped away from corporate, I was a little bit the same and had enough and been in a toxic environment. And I knew, and there's other things going on as well, but I took that step. And as I look back, I think it was quite a brave step. At the time, I didn't feel very brave, you know what I mean? In a weird way. It felt braver afterwards than I did during it. I just wonder your thoughts on your own step and what was it that made you take that step, and what was the motivation?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I didn't feel brave at the time. To your point, you shared you didn't either. That wasn't how I felt. I felt desperate, actually. It was coming from a place of, I cannot do this anymore. I can't keep up with the exhaustion of being somebody different to who I am. And I was surrounded by very, very clever men And not to say this men and women thing, but my brain works very differently. I am diagnosed with ADHD, and I didn't know that at the time. And I was surrounded by engineer men who I always looked at and thought were incredibly clever, and I wasn't. And these were all stories. I recognize that now because I've got lots of gifts that I wasn't really recognizing at the time. But I just remember sitting with my boss, and he was at the top of the organization, and saying, "You've got to go and do this project." And I just thought, I just haven't got it in me to do it. And so it wasn't a courageous step. It was a anymore step. Because if I do try and do it anymore, I'm myself so ill, just not going to be worth it. And so that's where it was coming from. And I remember driving home in the car, phoning Martin, getting home, getting a flip chart out and Post-it notes. All that time in business improvement, I've always got Post-it notes.
Of course, you would get a flip chart on a Post-it note. I was going to say, I wouldn't want anything else to be here, anything really.
And I literally wrote down on each flip chart, on each Post-it note, what I was good at and what I wasn't good at. And then I circled all that I actually liked doing. And what kept coming out was engagement with people, managing change with people, coaching people, mentoring people. And so I thought, and for the first sort of 12 months of doing that, I was still very masked. I was still very scared. I was still very afraid. I'd get these sort of executives coming into me for them going, I can't coach you because you're a CEO or you're an MD. And I still thought, but slowly as I went on my own personal journey of self-discovery, that started to come off. And I stopped talking with a posh accent and I started just talking with my Bolton one. And I stopped drinking red wine because that's what you're supposed to drink when you're in company. And I drank what I wanted. And I stopped watching the news so that I could be up to date with what's going on in the world, because the news used to impact me so hugely. I'd be thinking about the stories in the night, thinking about the people in those stories. And so I just stopped because I didn't have to do that anymore to impress anyone.
Wow. Sounds a great transformation. And we love your Bolton accent. We love it. It's interesting. I'm from Blackpool, the Northwest, but you wouldn't think that, because not that I consciously got rid of my accent. I was at university at 19 in the South, and it just went. You just fit in. It's that sort of, isn't it?
Exactly.
My daughter went to Canada, and she talks with a slightly funny Canadian accent, slightly almost feels Australian at times, but it's the human being of fitting in. You just your body unconsciously, subconsciously sometimes does things like that.
Yes.
Before we get into the sort of masks people might wear, what's your thoughts on, I suppose, that whole place of being, I suppose, modifying ourselves in a situation? So you're not putting a mask on, you're still authentic yourself, but we modify, don't we? Adapt to the people we're talking to. And how does that play in, and how do we decipher that between that and a mask?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think what I notice is either somebody is masked, and actually that's more people than we think. My research shows 97% of the people we've surveyed wear a mask. But this modification bit, what I notice the most around that is a home persona and a work persona. And I think what lies in the middle of that is this word professionalism. And people have a certain understanding of what professionalism means and how they need to be professional in the workplace. And so there's just subtle changes that happen, maybe in the way that somebody dresses, so they'll dress differently at home than they would at work, maybe in the accent that they use, maybe in how much they hold back in terms of speaking their mind or saying what's on their mind. Just small things. And I think those are okay, and there are certain situations where we need to modify to an extent. But when it becomes about covering up something that you think isn't good enough about yourself, that's when it starts to come into the mask. And that behavior is started, we repeat it and repeat it and repeat it until we've lost sight of who we are. And actually, we end up losing sight of who we are at home as well. And that starts to impact our relationships and how we feel about our loved ones. And it just all becomes, a big mess. But I think it just starts with that. I've got to be somebody different in different situations.
Yeah, because it is a difficult one, because you are in certain situations we have to dress accordingly sometimes.
Yeah.
It's a formal situation, it's a wedding through to I'm going to the races type of thing.
Yeah.
You might wear things you wouldn't normally wear, but it's trying to still be, for you to still shine through, as it were, in terms of your nature, your approach, your language.
Yeah.
And it can, I know it can be tricky. And and I'm in many different situations, as you are, with whether it's leaders, teams, from different sectors, and I have to modify my approach slightly in terms of the language I use, and realize when I say the word, sometimes psychological safety to some people or a team, they've got no idea what I'm talking about.
No.
And I might have to say things like how people feel safe to share things or to contribute, and I have to sort of unpack it a little bit more. And so it's just that modification which you have to do, which I think is important, but it's making sure that we have that authenticity. And so going to the masks we might wear, and just from your experience working with leaders, what are the sort of common masks people are wearing, and which ones you think seem to be the most exhausting ones to wear?
Yeah. Well, I guess what I've done over the last 6 years working with leaders, and I had hundreds and hundreds of them through in different places, what I've noticed is there are 4 masks, or I've identified 4 masks. So the first one is the mask of perfectionism, which is actually underpinned by, I'm so terrified of making a mistake, because mistakes are not okay. Mistakes have consequences, and that's been learnt through our childhood, that I'll now make sure that I go to the nth degree to make sure that everything is just so. And that mask, if you're a leader and you're wearing that mask, becomes an absolute nightmare for your team, because how you lead your team then is with these expectations that are unrealistic. And then how you lead yourself is with expectations that are even more unrealistic than that. And so it becomes like a machine that when people are in it, is just so difficult to succeed in. And we see really tricky behaviors like procrastination that comes in with perfectionist mask wearers, because their expectations of themselves and others are so high that often it's easier to just tune out and do nothing for a little while so you get some peace. And then, you put yourself under pressure. You hear leaders all the time going, "Oh, I love leaving things to the last minute because that pressure motivates and drives me and I get stuff done." And actually, they just make themselves even more stressed and put themselves under pressure to actually not be able to reach the levels of perfectionism that they expect of themselves, because they've not left enough time. And then they beat themselves up for that, and it drives the perfectionist mass of being even more, even bigger. So I guess that's the first one. The second one is the people pleaser mask, and you can wear all different ones, depending on the relationships that you have. So you don't just have one. But the people pleaser mask, people always go, "Oh, I'm really pleased I'm a people pleaser because that's the nicest one of the 4." And actually, it's not. I wrote about this on LinkedIn this morning, because it's like a survival mask, and it's one that is filling a need in you. So it's not about helping other people and being all noble and lovely and kind. It's about a need for approval, a need to get what I call strokes from people. And so I'll say yes when I mean no, because that'll make you like me. I'll do things that I don't really want to do, because that'll make you think I'm good. And it's just an exhausting way of working. And again, if you've got a people pleaser into a perfectionist, imagine what that's like. The perfectionist is demanding, the people pleaser is saying yes all the time, and it is just a hiding for burnout. So that's an interesting one. The persecutor of self is the next one, which is the person who whenever anything goes wrong, they immediately self-blame. They immediately fall into that everything must be my fault. The world hates me. Nobody likes me. I'm not good enough. That sort of self-critical mask that isn't coming from your real self, because your real self thinks you're amazing. It's coming from the should voice, I suppose, what you should be, and then your comparison against what you should be, and how then you make that mean that you're not good enough. So we've got that going on. And then we also have the persecutor of others, which to all intents and purposes is the one that nobody likes to admit to. And I know I have this as part of my makeup. The persecutor of others is the one that when things go wrong, and it's kind of like a deeper version of the perfectionist mask. When things go wrong, I can't cope with that to the extent that it's easier for me to deflect the blame. And so I'm looking for who's to blame. And a great example of that, I loved this story by Brené Brown, who's like a goddess actually in my world. Brené Brown talks about a coffee cup falling off the side in her kitchen. And she'd knocked the coffee cup off the side, but her first thought was, oh my God, Steve, I can't believe you left the coffee cup there. And Steve is her husband, who wasn't in the room, was nowhere near the fact that the cup had come off the side. But rather than looking at herself and saying, I've done that, she immediately went into blame mode. And that's what the persecutor of others does. And it's just another self-protection of, I can't cope with accepting the responsibility, so I'll look to deflect to somebody else.
And people listening right now are probably mentally, they might not be saying it out loud, are ticking a little box and, oh yes, I'm a perfectionist. I try and do things, and that's me. And people pleaser. Oh yes, I do. I did a lot of people pleasers out there. Oh yes, and I run myself down. It's always my fault. Or I'm known as the pit bull in the office because I go after people when things go wrong. And yes, and I think people are probably thinking, "Oh, I'm probably a mixture of those," and that's what happens, isn't it? Just I suppose a fundamental question: what's the root cause of why we do this? And it might just help people understanding of what's going on in our psyche or psychology or whatever it is of why we put on these masks that we've had since childhood.
Well, if we go back to the fundamental reason we exist and what our basic needs are, it's about being able to belong and about being able to avoid the sense of rejection. Those are like the two driving forces that we, from the day we were born, as we start to experience the world, those are the things that we're seeking. And actually, one almost like erodes the other one. And so as we start to experience life and things happen to us along the way, we start to learn what rejection feels like, because it does happen. And we start to learn what it feels like when we're not accepted into a group, maybe at school, not being in the in crowd at school with a group of friends. We start to know what that feels like, and we don't like it. And so we build coping loops, coping mechanisms that help us avoid that feeling moving forwards. And because these experiences, when they first happen, are almost like imprinted in our mind as something that we need to avoid because they're threatening to us, we become very adept at the coping mechanism that avoids it. And so we just keep going through these loops, and they become stronger and stronger and stronger. And the mask becomes more and more layered. But it is all because we just want to fit in and we don't want to get rejected.
It's that innate survival instinct, isn't it? To be part of the tribe, part of the group. We don't want to be displaced. We don't want to be on our own. We don't want to be isolated. And we do those things to, almost chameleon-like, isn't it? To sort of, and I know we talked about modifications, that's okay, but it's this fundamental shift. And as you say, something that becomes who you are. It becomes your character, your behaviors, and it's so, the neural pathways are so sort of used so much,
well trodden.
It's actually, it just immediately happens. It's almost there's an instant.
We totally lose sight of who we are, you know, what we're about, what we like, what we don't like, what we need. We lose sight of all of it because it's hidden underneath these layers of what we should be, what we ought to be, what we must be, what we can do, what we can't do. These like self-imposed rules that we put around ourselves based on the experience that we've had. And you said earlier, you know, I bet people are sitting there nodding along. And a lot of people do sit and nod along when you talk about the pretender model. But most people don't understand the extent to which they wear it until they really start to go through the process of uncovering what lies beneath it. And when we did the survey, we've surveyed nearly 1,900 people now around this, all leaders and executives, and 97% of them said that they wear a mask, which is absolutely enormous when we think about this word authenticity, which is bandied about all over the place. Most people in organizations are not being authentic, which means that they're not leading authentically, which means that the people who are following those leaders are picking up these same behaviors. And, you know, you're all about resilience, Julian. And if we think about that from a resilience point of view, we're actually hampering resilience because people are learning that this masked version of them is what's accepted in the workplace and what my leader does and what their leader does. And therefore, we are in an exhaustion loop all the time at work. How can we be resilient if that's how we're living?
Well, no, if you're living in almost in somebody else's shoes or somebody who you're really not, that takes an awful lot of energy and an awful lot of cognitive sort of thinking about to do things, because it's not who you really are, and it will clash, it will jar, it will do all sorts of things in you internally, and I think that's really quite challenging. So we have these masks, and people are probably thinking, okay, I recognize one or two of those, and probably to a certain extent, they're probably not the insight that, you know, they might have all the detail of all that. How can they, I suppose, break the cycle? How can they do something about it? What can they do? I know, you know, they can come to you and sort of be helped that way, but what sort of things can they start to do right now that would really help them to start to unpick that mask?
Well, if we go back to how did the mask go on, we've mentioned rejection and belonging, but from that comes this sense of, what do I believe about myself and the world? And often our beliefs are limited. And what are my true values? Not the company values, not the ones my parents had. What are mine? And often people don't know what their values are. They know when they're trampled on because they feel a visceral response, but they don't actually know what their values are. They've just inherited ones. And, you know, they might say integrity because everybody says integrity, don't they? So we've got to really understand what your beliefs are, both limiting and helpful, and what your values stand for. And then from that position, we can start to build up what I call self-value and self-trust. And self-value is all about the things that you love about yourself. Because honestly, when I talk to individuals, they can tell me everything they don't like. They can tell me all the things that need to change, all the gaps, very, very easily. But when I say to them, write down 100 things that you love about yourself, they laugh. And then they might roll their eyes and go, what's the point in that? And then I say, well, try it. And then they go home and they start to do the exercise, and I'll get a WhatsApp guaranteed in the evening that says, well, this is hard. Because it is, whether it's a CEO or, you know, a COO or, you know, anyone trying to write down 100 things that they genuinely love about themselves, they struggle with it. And that's the kind of, I call it the self-value baseline, because it gives us an understanding of where we're at in terms of what we love. And if we can't find things that we love about ourselves, then the pretender mask goes on, because we're focusing on what's wrong with us. The inner critic voice starts to pipe up. The judge voice starts to pipe up. The you're not good enough voice. And therefore, if I just stick my perfectionist mask on, I can avoid all that. So we've really got to drive up the self-value. And we've also got to drive up self-trust, which is about saying what's on your mind. It's about speaking up, speaking your truth. It's about those wobbly head conversations that you have with yourself at night, where you go, oh, I wish I'd said that. Can't believe that person said that to me and I just let it happen. That's the person we need to tune into. That person is overshooting when they're doing the wobbly head moment because it's coming from a place of anger and I wish I'd done this. But actually, if we take that anger out of it, the premise of what I should say, the premise of what I should have done, that's the real self. And if we can tune into that more quickly at the time and honor that version of us, then our self-trust starts to improve. And by increasing self-value and self-trust, we're less likely to need the perfectionist mask.
That's really, really helpful. And I think, that whole sort of trying to find, what's good about you, 100 things, which is a long list to do, but a very important exercise. Because it ties into that whole sort of self-compassion piece, doesn't it? And I talked to a lot of leaders where, they're getting stressed about or being quite hard on themselves. We have this harshness about ourselves and we're high standards and we should have done that and it's not very good. And I said, well, if somebody else was thinking that and you as a friend of yours and you were telling them, what would you say to them? They'd go, well, I'd take this, that's okay. Have a bit of slack here and you'd be completely different. And I think it's that change. We're so hard on ourselves and we do find it hard. And I know I've done those exercises years ago where people do the strengths and weaknesses piece in a very sort of basic, people come up with a whole load of weaknesses and almost put themselves down. And I know we're more negatively biased as individuals because that helps us with the survival piece. But people struggle sometimes to almost strength. And I don't know if there's also a cultural thing in certainly England, UK, where we don't like talking about how good we are at something because it feels a bit sort of, I don't know, sort of arrogant and super confident. And I don't know, there's a bit of a cultural thing. Have you noticed any cultural things? Have you noticed that around?
You're so right about, do you know, well, now that I have this thing called shaky pom-poms. And again, people laugh at that, like they laugh at the self-value baseline. But being able to celebrate your successes, even the tiny ones, and in that shaky pom-pom way that I talk about, is so key because it's a massive part of resilience building. Because I call it shining a light on what's right. We're looking at what's right about us, what's good about us, what we've done well, and noticing that. Perfectionists hardly ever notice what they do well. They just move on to the next thing, striving. It's so important to stop and recognize what's good. In all of my groups with coaches, we have the celebrations on Fridays. I used to do this with my teams in corporate as well. What have we done that we've done well and what are you proud of? And it's so important because you're right. The cultural backdrop is you're a big head. If you say what's good about you, you're arrogant if you celebrate a success. And that then creates this sort of backdrop that it's not okay. And therefore, we're more likely to start focusing on what's wrong with us because that's what everybody is doing around us.
Yeah.
We've really got to change that narrative to one that celebrates what's good.
Yeah, one of my daily habits for building personal resilience is one of them is celebrate success. And that can be a small thing, can be a big thing. And, we all have goals and all things to want to achieve in our lives, but they can be sometimes months, years away. But you've got to, celebrate those little milestones as you get closer to them. And whether that's personally or in a team or any context. And I think, I always encourage people, whether it's going out for a drink, going out for a meal, depending, do it appropriately to the size of what you think is a milestone. It's just good to put up almost a line in the sand of look, we've done great. We've got to this milestone of X. We're going to have a meal about this. If you're, if you just started a new business, I've just got my first client through to I've got my first 10 clients or whatever it may be. And I think it's just good to recognize that because it sort of, it builds in confidence for us as well. Because it thinks, okay. And it's that almost that, self-value piece again. Oh, look what I'm doing. This is really good because I'm achieving things and it reminds myself. And so that continual cycle builds that resilience to keep going and the energy and motivation to keep going forward as well.
Do you know, I think everybody should have a set of pom-poms, Julian, because it doesn't even have to cost anything. Like, you don't have to go out for a meal if you've got your pom-poms. You just give them a shake and it's like, yeah.
I must invest in some
I
pom-poms.
think you should.
Just a very quick thing, really. It's just as we finish. So we get clarity of what the masks are on. We unpick that. We start to do this whole sort of self value and trust. And what have you found with the leaders you've worked with where they started to drop this mask? Or what's been the sort of the result of this, the outcome of this in their lives?
Do you know, I am known for being the coach that causes the most divorces, the most leavers from organizations. We might look at that and sort of chuckle a little bit, but often when you are becoming the real version of you, you recognize that the life you've built up around you has been built up around the masked version. And therefore, it doesn't actually match who you are on the inside. And as soon as you get the courage to start letting that real you through, you recognize that the real you doesn't fit where you've been for the last 10, 15 years. And so quite often it creates a change, quite a significant life change into something that will serve you more, just like my own story was. But also, if somebody does stay in the environment that they're in, they go through a transition phase, which is quite messy to start with. So it's very easy to tune back out of it and think, I don't want to go there, because people around you don't like the transition that you're making because you're changing, you're different. And that makes them feel uncertain. They can't predict how you're going to behave. And so there's like this messy middle that happens. I mean, we know that's part of transition anyway. And people need to be brave through that transition and just keep coming back to the real them. And that's often something that you need support with, because when you're trying to do that on your own, it's easier to just stick the mask back on. But when you come out the other side of that, relationships strengthen, who you are is easier to live with, the impact that you make as a coach. So right at the start of this, we talked about this modifying yourself. Like, I'm going to the House of Commons next week, and there's the old part of me going, oh my God, Bolton are in the House of Commons. How's that going to work? What am I going to wear? I did have all of those little thought processes. And then I just kind of got in the way of that and said, Angela, just rock up as yourself like you do everywhere. This is me. This is who you meet wherever you meet Angela. Because I'm
sure it's going to be very colourful, I know you're very
colourful, because I do like a bit of colour, as you know. But just being yourself is so much easier because you don't have to overthink it. You talked about the cognitive load. You don't have that. And actually what I've learned and what my clients learn now coming out the back of this journey is they're so much more accepted. They belong so much more because they're choosing the right places to be. And they achieve, I've certainly achieved so much more than I ever did in corporate. And I'm okay while I'm doing it, and my clients are okay while I'm doing it. But the process to get there is horrible, and it's really easy just to go, oh, I don't want to do that. I'll put my mask back on.
Particularly if you've been wearing it for 20, 30 years of your life. It's very hard to have that shift. And you made a point about other people don't like you changing because they feel uncomfortable and they're not sure, or it feels uncertainty. And that can be quite a challenge as well as you start shaping and doing different behaviors that they've not seen before. We could carry on talking, Angela, and really, it's really insightful, really helpful. I think it's hopefully will provoke a few thoughts and may cause people for action to do something about it. If people are interested in, want to connect with you, get in touch with you, what's the best way of doing that?
Probably on LinkedIn. I mean, I'm on LinkedIn every day, posting usually. So Angela Cox on LinkedIn, and Pasida 360, which no one can ever say, Julian. So there's no point me even saying it out loud. But Pasida 360 is the website if you're interested in coaching, coach training, etc.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for your time today, Angela.
Oh, it's been a joy. I'll see you next week, no doubt.
Absolutely, you will.